Hello and welcome to another edition of Canada Files. I'm Jim Deeks. Our guest on this program is the highly respected investigative reporter for the New York Times, Susanne Craig. Born and raised in Calgary, Alberta, and a former business reporter for Toronto's Globe and Mail, Susanne has been a journalist based in New York for more than 20 years. In 2019, she and two colleagues were awarded the very prestigious Pulitzer Prize for their extensive investigation into the real story behind Donald Trump's rise to billionaire status. Susanne joined us recently here in our Toronto studio. Sue, before we get into your background and career, I must ask, were you and your colleagues not terrified of the potential repercussions as you were doing your research into the Donald Trump story and after it was printed? I mean, there must have been some very powerful forces that would not have been very happy about what you were looking into.
There were a lot of people who we knew would be unhappy. In addition, we had a lot of confidential records that were involved in the story that won the Pulitzer. There was bank records and tax records. So we had a lot of discussions about it throughout, but ultimately we felt, and I guess part of it is just spending so much time with the material that we had that produced the story. We felt very confident when we went to press with the story. You know, we accused, and it was the first time the New York Times had ever done that, a sitting president of tax fraud. We felt really comfortable about that accusation and that we had the goods because we knew the material so well and we had spent so much time reporting it out that we felt confident about it. So on the one hand, I think there was, talk and discussion throughout the way, but as we went along, I think we just became more and more comfortable with what we had. And
were you ever looking over your shoulders to see if there were people following you, or did you get any threats?
Well, I'm a bit paranoid by nature, so I'm always looking over my shoulder. But we live in an interesting time in the United States right now as reporters. I've been covering Trump now since not long after he announced his candidacy for president in 2016. And one thing I don't think you can ever get accustomed to is things like in our newsroom, we have to go through active shooter training now. You sort of in a world, when you work in an office, you'd love to have a window seat. Well, now it's sort of a hazard at the New York Times because we're surrounded by other buildings where they have to do security checks to make sure there aren't people either looking in through the windows to see what's on our screens or people who may have guns. I mean, that stuff is now a reality for reporters at the New York Times, and I think that that's always on our mind in a way that's unfortunate because there's a pretty big cause and effect between that and the hate speech that the President of the United States spews about reporters.
Well, I want to ask you about that in a minute, but the story you wrote that won the Pulitzer Prize was actually 14,000 words. It took you and your colleagues 18 months to put together. Can you give us just the gist of what the story was all about? I mean, it basically stated that Donald Trump is not the self-made billionaire that he claims to be, correct?
Well, there's two components to it. One was that he's not the self-made billionaire, and he had run for president claiming that he was a self-made billionaire. And we looked both at that claim, but also what was interesting was the hundreds of millions that he inherited from his father, which was the component to that. He was actually, he's the son of a very, very wealthy Manhattan builder. But also we looked at the fact that that fortune that he inherited from his father was enhanced through direct tax fraud.
You probably were already on Mr. Trump's hate list because you did a major story in 2016 about his taxes. What did you discover then in 2016, and how did you get the information about his taxes when he's refused to release any returns?
In 2016, I had been covering him for several months, and I've been doing a lot of stuff on his finances. And then in September 2016, which was just weeks before the election, 6 or 7 weeks out, in late September, I go to my mailbox one afternoon. I was actually closing a story on Hillary Clinton. It was going to run on this Sunday. I whipped by my mailbox on a Friday afternoon, and there was an envelope there. And I opened it.
Classic brown envelope.
Yeah, with the Trump Organization on the return. And who knows if it's real or not. A lot of people send fake mail, but I opened it, and inside were 3 pages of Donald Trump's 1995 tax returns. Well, we didn't know it could be. We get a lot of stuff in the mail that's crazy. You don't know if it's real or not. It turned out we were able to verify it. We were able to confirm. There was tax returns are really, I guess, just to step back, really hard to confirm. They're hard to get and hard to confirm. They're hard to confirm. You basically have to get either one of the participants or an accountant or somebody who has the returns who can confirm the information. In this case, the accountant who signed them confirmed that, in fact, that was his signature and knew a lot about the information on the return. But what was significant about the return was that in 1995, Donald Trump had almost $1 billion in losses that flowed through to his return. What that meant not only was that he had $1 billion in losses, which is huge, but it also, when you have that many losses under the US tax code, when you lose money, the IRS sort of says, well, you can use that going forward to shelter future income to kind of get yourself back on your feet. Think of it a bit like a gift card from the IRS. So he had $1 billion gift card to shelter future taxable income up to $1 billion, all things being equal. So then 6 months later, 3 or 4 more pages of his tax returns another reporter gets them, and they're from 2005, 10 years later, and he actually made a profit that year. And we were like just shocked that he could have burned through all those losses. And that's what started, just kind of a simple thing, was how did he manage to make money in 2005 given the ability he had never to pay tax again? And we started to dig into what was going on in his life in 2004 and 2005. Because we just wanted to know, like, was there an unusual event? And it turns out Fred Trump, his father, this man who he had said was just this small-time builder out in Brooklyn, didn't leave him a lot of money. There was only 30. There was only 30. Only gave him $1 million loan, and there was only $30 million in the estate. Was in fact, pretty much a billionaire. Yeah. By the time you analyze both the buildings that he owned, hundreds of millions of dollars in building, he had no debt. So he also had hundreds of millions of dollars in cash. And we started to look into that, and it was just a progression of that odyssey that took us to the Pulitzer Prize-winning story in October 2018.
Aside from nerves of steel to do this and to think I've got major information here, what does it take to be a good investigative reporter?
It's probably a combination of things. Patience is one. I think you've got to be really good at photocopying. We always joke we spend a lot of time in records rooms.
It's a skill.
Yeah, and it's also just sort of knowing there's a lot of times as a reporter you get to a point and you're like, we should publish. And you get to a point where you don't think you should publish and your editors do. And then you have to know sort of when to push and when to pull on that. But it's just sort of knowing, and just, I think kind of persistence is the main thing, but it's also sort of knowing when the right time is to go and when you should just kind of keep going. And we had moments in the story where we could have gone to press, but we kept going because we just all felt like there was more there. And we don't think 2 weeks ever passed where we weren't finding more stuff. And we always thought that was a good litmus test of like, we're still getting like really big stuff every week and mining the documents that we had once we got them. It took us months to get a hold of those documents, and then it took us, we spent 3 weeks just scanning the documents. Like this sort of reporting takes time and patience. Yeah.
You graduated from university, but not with a degree in journalism.
No.
How did you manage to get into this profession? How did you manage to get interested in journalism without a degree from a journalistic school?
Yeah. So I went to the University of Calgary and I had political science and I studied American history. But when I first got to the University of Calgary, I didn't have a lot of money, and I was out talking to friends, and they mentioned that the student newspaper, if you go there, you can get free movie tickets and like tickets to go see dinner theater. So I thought this was a great way to kind of get stuff for free, like we can go to the movie, write a movie review, not quite free because you got to do some work for it. But so that's how I started reporting. I just showed up at the university paper and volunteered, and then I started covering council. The student body council, got really into that and just fell in love with journalism. And I knew right then that's what I wanted to do.
And then subsequently, you started to get into financial reporting, economic reporting. Yeah. And that's a discipline that requires quite a lot other than just an inquisitive mind. I mean, you've got to understand macro and microeconomics. You've got to understand how stock markets work. You've got to understand corporate balance sheets. Was this something that just came naturally to you, or was it in your DNA?
Well, I kind of like showing up to work every day, regardless of what you're doing, is sort of like getting a master's degree and like going to university, but you're doing it like for your, I mean, it's really fun to kind of try and master these things. I've been doing financial reporting now for 20 years, so you sort of learn as you go. But I loved business reporting. I didn't think I would. I thought it would be really boring when I showed up. I started at the Financial Post in Toronto back in the 90s, and I took it because I wanted to come to Toronto. But I just kind of fell in love with it. I always remember there was a boss of mine at the Wall Street Journal, and when he was hiring me, and I went down for my final interview, and his office overlooked the stock exchange, and he looked over and he said, "Money, power, and greed, what more could a reporter want?" And I think that that's, at the essence of all these complicated things, are human beings who are fallible and incredibly interesting, and being able to cover that and to look for those stories, that's how we bring the numbers to life. But you kind of have to understand the foundation of it to find all that, but the way that they talk to each other is just something I love.
You really honed your skills in financial reporting at the Globe and Mail, Toronto's Globe and Mail, which is the national
Incredible
newspaper of Canada.
Yeah.
How did you go from the Globe and Mail into the really big leagues of journalism in New York?
Yeah. So I loved working at the Globe and Mail and could see myself spending years there. And I was always interested in the U.S. Partly, I studied it and had an interest in it in school, but it really sharpened how I thought about it. And every day when I was at the Globe and Mail and I would go for lunch, and I would see then the executive editor of the Globe and Mail, William Thorsell, reading the Wall Street Journal, and he would be by himself just going through these stories. And I started reading it more religiously and just fell in love with how they told stories and how they just put these things together and were so good at it. They were just I used it when I was working at the Globe and Mail to improve my reporting there. But I never kind of ever grew up thinking I would ever work in America, just like the complications of getting to these papers and how good you must have to be to get there. And I would apply to the Wall Street Journal and they would just keep rejecting me. And so one time though I applied and I got rejected, but the guy who interviewed me said, "I'm going to send your stuff down to this editor in New York." And I got a call from him and had to do a lot of proposals on how I would cover things, but eventually got hired at the Wall Street Journal in 2000. I got a working visa and kind of just worked through the system and broke that all down and figured it out.
And fast forward 8 years, one of the biggest stories that you covered in 2008 was the collapse of one of the most revered, most successful investment houses on Wall Street, Lehman Brothers.
Yeah.
I won't ask you about what happened in that story because I think we all remember, but I will ask you, 12 years later, what was wrong with Wall Street that a big firm like that could go under?
I think that's sort of more the way that I would look at it, and I think more the things now when I kind of look back, and I think the risk that was in the system was incredible, and it wasn't questioned enough. And I think that's, when I look now, you sort of always have a trust and verify, but you have to wake up every morning and just bring a huge amount of skepticism to your reporting, and also just look sometimes where, they're presenting something, but what's over here. And there's a lot of parallels to that with, when I look at Donald Trump and what we went through for the story that ran in October 2008, that won the Pulitzer. When you look at how he was able to, for decades, to just spin this lie that he was really rich, and he wasn't. And that's because he started, and we look at in the 1970s, and the New York Times was one of the first papers, if not the first, to publish an in-depth interview on him when he claimed to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And that was repeated over and over and over without verification. He made the list of America's richest people without the actual, he didn't have that money. And you sort of think that's, there's just a lot of parallel lessons. It wasn't necessarily a unique situation, but you learn from that really just to question everything that's put in front of you unless you're able to confirm it. And if not, say somebody said it, don't just say it as a fact.
Does uncovering the truth for a living make you a rather cynical, if not even negatively biased reporter? You've seen so many things that aren't true that you've uncovered the truth. How does that affect you and your judgment?
I think I've seen a lot of these things now. You mentioned Lehman Brothers and now covering the president. I just think you become more skilled at navigating the lies, because when you're writing about these things too, you're not just trying to get underneath the lies that are being told to you, but your own reputation is on the line when you put a story on the front page of the New York Times. So I think it's kind of that's also something that you need to, it's part of the factor that you have to really question everything. And it doesn't mean that a lot of people come to you and they're telling the truth, but it's just getting to that truth.
Does being Canadian or being from Canada give you, do you think, an advantage in your approach to the work, or does it give you perhaps a different perspective from the rest of your American colleagues?
I don't think so much it's being from Canada. I think it's being from away. I think gives you definitely a different perspective, and I think it's healthy. Just by the nature that you're not from there, I think you look at things differently, you see things differently, and you appreciate other things. You also just have a different set of reference point. I mean, I grew up in Canada, just on a media level. I grew up with, watching CBC and the CTV and seeing how Canada sees itself in the world. Then you go to the U.S. and see how the U.S. is really, how U.S.-centric it is. You only need to watch CNN for 10 minutes to get that. And I just think seeing just the media landscape, but also just coming from a different place, I just think gives you that distance. And I also just, in covering U.S. politics, I don't think, I'm really passionate as a reporter, but I'm not as passionate about, the horse race, because I didn't grow up with it. It's not part of, it's not in my bloodstream. I mean, politics in Canada is, but politics there isn't, and I think that gives me a really healthy distance that I just think improves my work.
What does being Canadian mean to you? 20 years you've been living in New York, but you're still fiercely Canadian. You've told me before we came on the air that you would never reject or renounce your Canadian citizenship. What does being Canadian mean?
Well, when you're in New York, it means that you know how you can pick out great winter shoes for winter, because nobody seems to have figured that out.
Very important.
But I really identify with Canada. I'm Canadian. It doesn't mean that that I don't love things about the United States, but I just am fiercely Canadian.
I won't ask your feelings, your personal feelings about the president, but let me ask, have you personally noticed a difference in, not necessarily your friends, but people you meet and you say, I'm a journalist, since he has described the media and journalists as enemies of the people and human scum? Has that affected the way people deal with you?
I think it has, because certain people, and I think you see, I have friends who have supported Trump. They either still do or they voted for him and don't now, but they really don't see your job as a journalist. I come in every day and my job is to hold people in power to account and to find out things that are going on. I covered the governor of New York, a Democratic governor, for several years, and I did the same job there. I mean, I'm not on his Christmas card list either. And I think people, though, take it much more personally with Trump, and they see it as a personal affront. And it just is interesting to me because I don't filter it that way, but I'm aware that other people do.
The profession that you're in, and as long as you've been in it, has changed substantially. I'm sure you'd agree. I mean, the media is different, the whole landscape. Newsrooms are much smaller than they were when you started out. More is expected of journalists every day. What do you think is the future of newspapers specifically? Will there be a New York Times in 25 years?
I think there will be a New York Times. I don't think it'll be the New York Times that you see today, though. I think there'll be, if not no print, there'll be less, newspapers actually hitting the pavement in the morning. But the New York Times will be there, It's been there for 100, 200 years. It's going to continue to survive, I think, 100 and more years down the road. But I think it's going to be more digital. There's going to be more video. I think it's going to be a more dynamic prospect in that part. But I think what concerns me is the death of local newspapers in both in Canada and in the United States. I'm from Calgary. I grew up in a 2-newspaper town. It was incredible. They were very competitive. And now they are owned by the same owner. They have a shared newsroom, and one reporter reports for both newspapers. You can't say that that's good, because the competition, I think, breeds excellence in a lot of situations, particularly when you're competing on a beat. And that's sort of what hurts me, is that we're losing so much local news and local voices and things that aren't being found out about.
Do you worry, though, that we will also lose investigative reporting like you do? Because you spent 18 months on that story, you and 2 other colleagues, very few media outlets could ever afford to devote those resources for that amount of time for one story.
No, it's really concerning, and I think about it all the time. And when those newsrooms are shutting or they're shutting down, often the first thing to go is investigative reporting. The New York Times has really invested in it, and I think it's great. I just wish it had been, when you see all these other things going on, it's hard because Twitter is no replacement for it. Twitter is just something else over here and these short sound bites that we get, but we need really great investigative reporting.
Let me ask about the Pulitzer. What has winning that very prestigious prize done for your career?
I mean, just on I guess I think about it both on a personal level, just like what an amazing thing it was. But I also, at a professional level, I always say you're only as good as your last story, and I always feel that pressure every day at work. So I'm still you still show up every day, and you're there for 10 or 12 hours trying to get your next story going.
Has it given you more respect as a journalist in the sense that when people get a call from Susanne Craig now, do they go, oh, I better take that because she's amazing? Or conversely, oh my God, it's Susanne Craig, she's lethal, I'm not going to take that call at all?
I think it depends who I'm calling on that one. But,
of course.
No, but it's interesting. I think it's more, I find, the Pulitzer was obviously about the president, but I think just covering the president for the last 4 years has just, people are more aware of who I am. I mean, I can walk down the street and somebody may recognize me, but that's just, I think, a byproduct of covering, and not just a president, but covering a TV president. And it's so much more now is about television. And I don't think that's all good, but I think that that's sort of more, just sort of elevated who I am. I'm the same person I was 8 years ago. I just happen to now be covering somebody who's, very TV savvy and who's in the White House.
Of all the stories you've covered, do you have a personal favorite? Not necessarily the investigative
That's like picking
ones,
your favorite song. It's a hard one, but a few come to mind. I think one in particular, which is in 2005 when I was at the Wall Street Journal. I was covering Wall Street, and I was covering at that point. It was a scandal on Wall Street about traders giving firms who send them business gifts and entertaining. And in the middle of that, I found out about this incredible party that a few of the firms had thrown for Fidelity, a big mutual fund and investment house in the United States. And it was just so off the charts. And one of the things that they did was there was a bachelor party for one of the traders at Fidelity, and they threw a huge party for him down in Miami, and pretty much all of it was paid for by various Wall Street firms. But in the midst of all of this, somebody had hired a dwarf to...
Well, that was in the movie, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
Yes.
It ended up being in a movie.
The Wolf of Wall Street.
Yeah, that scene was, it's sort of become kind of famous. But Wall Street has this obsession with dwarfs that I don't quite understand, but I'm happy to write about it. So one other one comes to mind that I really had a lot of fun on, which was I did an investigation into the judging of the Westminster Dog Show.
An investigative report on the Westminster Dog Show.
Yeah, it's sort of like a best in show situation,
Yeah.
but it was funny. I went to the Westminster, I love dogs, and I went to the Westminster Dog Show in New York, and I happened to go with somebody who breeds German Shepherds and knew a lot about the field when we were there. And she kept saying, this person's gonna win, and this person's gonna win, and this person's not gonna win. And I was like, how do you know all this? And well, it turns out, I mean, she happened to know this one category because she knew all the players in it, but everybody's connected and the fix is kind of in. The judges often have connections to the dogs or to the coaches of the dogs. So I went and spent like a couple months looking at just basically the connectivity of all the judges to the dogs and how conflicted it is. And it was incredible to see, we looked at the German Shepherd judge, and he was not only a breeder, he bred this famous dog named Captain Crunch, this German Shepherd, and had blood ties to almost every dog that he was judging, and knew all the trainers of the dogs. And we were just like, wow, like this actually is kind of fixed.
How can you not become a cynical person when something as pure and American apple pie as the Westminster Dog Show is fixed?
Yeah, it's kind of everything you kind of look into stuff and you don't expect. So yeah, it's sort of pull a string and that's what you find.
Well, we assume that you've still got many years, well over 20 years of energy left to continue to do what you do, but is that your ambition, just to continue to be a good investigative reporter, or do you have other loftier goals, if they can be loftier?
I mean, right now, everything's sort of coming at you. I only think in like 1 week ahead increments. But when I step back, I mean, I think one day I'd like to write a book, and it's something I haven't done. And you know, I would never preclude coming back to Canada. I really love being here, and maybe coming back to the Globe and Mail or something like that would be great. You know, but I really do love what I do, and I would be happy to continue to do it at the Times, you know, for as long as they'll have me. It really is, it's a great job to have, and I really do love it, so.
Well, you obviously do a very good job at it, and we are delighted that you joined us on Canada Files. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next edition of Canada Files.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of the Sonner Foundation, as well as the following donors: the John and Jocelyn Barford Family Foundation, Mary Alice Davis, in memory of Glenn W. Davis; John and Margaret Deeks, Wendy Deeks, in memory of Peter A. Deeks; Richard and Donna Ivy, Alice and Ted Kernahan; the Bruce H. Mitchell Foundation, Andrew and Valerie Pringle, Eleanor and Francis Shen; the Browning Watt Foundation, William E. Wilder; and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.